And a lot of that's because of shock. I can tell you, Matt, that even the Republican state legislators, when they first learned of it, were in utter disbelief because it wasn't something they were so familiar with. For example, I've met Robin Lundstrom many times. She's a friend now, I can say. She was the first one to get a bill banning the transing of kids in the state of Arkansas. And when she was brought, when they were, she was discussing that with her colleagues back in 2020 or 2021, it passed. It was the first bill passed in April of 2021. Uh, she thought, oh, this is this transing kids thing. This is just California, New York. This is not in Arkansas. And then someone came to her and said, actually, there's a couple hundred kids at the Little Rock Children's Hospital where they're doing this. And she was floored. And so she took action right away. But I mean, and to their great credit in Arkansas, even though they had to override a Republican governor's veto of the bill, they got it done right away. I mean, so there have been states where you have to really urge them to move, but there have been some wonderful exceptions where when they get it, they moved and they got it done. And in 2023, there were 17 states in that year alone that prohibited the transing of kids, some bills better than others, but that forced the issue to be uh, a national conversation piece because suddenly people realized something's really wrong here because why are they banning this if it's not happening?
My guest today is Brandon Showalter, a journalist at the Christian Post and the host of Generation Indoctrination, Inside the Transgender Battle, a documentary series on transgender ideology and its impacts on family, society, and especially children. Since October 2022, Brandon's podcast has explored the capture of schools, clinics, courts, and other institutions by gender ideology. He has meanwhile quietly served as a commanding presence in Washington, D.C., not simply covering resistance, but organizing it. Brandon is friends with everyone important in this movement, and he is personally responsible for putting many people in the same room together with decisive results. He is ready for his debriefing. Brandon, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. It's good to be with you.
So let's dive right into the secret history of you, because you don't talk about yourself very much. The effective people never do. My
Well, yeah, thank you. And I definitely don't. I'm happy to share a brief background. It's just I stumbled into journalism after having spent, I say this is on my bio, I believe. I was a janitor, believe it or not. And I got an idea one day to just start writing, and I did. 1 year later, I wound up applying for a job at the Christian Post. A friend had sent me an email, and I just thought, well, I was so desperate to make a change, I'll give this a shot. And I went through my trial period and managed to get through that. It was kind of tough going because I'd never done journalism before, but managed to nail the writing style enough to convince my editors to bring me on full time. And then I think a key moment happened with respect to the gender ideology space that I've worked for now nearly a decade on. Here we are, 2026, and I started in June, so it'll be a full decade come June. But um, I, one of my editors walked in the room and he was speaking about all of these proposed quote unquote conversion therapy bans, which at the time I didn't know that was applicable to gender transitions. And I was wondering if I should really take this on because it was so touchy. But I started looking into it and I decided that I would, tackle it. And that article and some others that I would write caused me to fall down the rabbit hole. And I've never been the same since. And that was at the tail end of the Obama years. And so then Trump was elected. And so everything just got more chaotic for all sorts of reasons. But in those early days, very few people were talking about it. And in 2017, we did a big series here at the Christian Post on gender ideology, transgenderism. And I peaked, as they said. And so I kept digging in and started meeting people, starting to hear the concerns from women's rights activists and started meeting new people and getting sources and leads. And I just realized what was at stake. And then when you learn about the medical aspect, everything just changes because then you see children being drugged and sterilized and cut up and becomes one of those things where you just can't look away. And so here I am, almost 10 years later, battle scarred and, bruised, but still standing. And Christian Post, thank God, my editors have stood by me and backed me up the entire time. But it has been the silver lining, I will say, in this brutal slog of really tough journalistic work, both in print and in the docu podcast you mentioned, has been conversing and meeting with all kinds of interesting people, many of whom are not religious and don't share my views on many things, but taking an ecumenical approach, as you say, that has been a real joy amid the horror of all of this. And so, yeah, that's what I've been trying to do for the last 9.5 years.
So there's this theme, this really stupid idea about people like us who report on the harms and the policy capture and so
Yeah.
on, that we are paid professional right wingers.
Yeah.
But I don't know many in this scene who came to gender critical discourse professionally, except journalists, people who had someone come along and say, please look into my story. And I've met a couple of people at Heritage, thanks to you, who we can say were involved in this issue as part of their profession because people like Kara Dansky, a Democrat, brought it to their
Yeah.
attention. So
Yeah.
please tell us how you came to this issue, who you met along the way that was trying to raise hell, and who are these professional transphobes, quote unquote, and how did you become one of us?
Well, I sort of came to it on my own in a way because what I realized when I started realizing just how everything had shifted, um, one of the things that I noticed first off was how the legacy media was, using the lingo. And I remember reading something. There were two things that I remember reading. One was it might have even been in the Huffington Post just a left-wing publication, but I was confused because they were referring to a man as a she, but there was a woman, an actual woman who was named in the article, and I couldn't understand why this man was being called she. I thought, did the editors just miss that, or were they was someone was quoted with and it was referred to as she, and I thought, well, did they mean to attribute that to the actual woman in the piece? And so I was so confused reading the news article about whatever subject it was, and I just thought, oh, this is weird. Like I shouldn't. Why am I being confused when it should seem like a straightforward thing? And anyway, but then I think it was pretty soon after that I saw the New York Times report the phrase in the lead paragraph of the article right there at the beginning about these trans children were assigned the wrong sex at birth. And it was reported so nonchalantly and matter of factly as though that was the most objective, truthful thing you could say. Who would you, question? Why would you question it? And I remember my heart jumped into my throat at just the utter brazenness of that lie, of that it's possible to, you know, be assigned the wrong sex at birth. And the fact that it was reported so cavalierly was just, it revealed to me the extent of the brainwashing, the deception, the ideological commitment to these things. And I remember talking to my editors and I said, we cannot play nice with this. We cannot play footsie with this because I think, as you well know, Matt, one of the things that people do when you start to meet people who sense that there's something wrong here is they default to this sense of politeness. Even pastors, Christians especially, are vulnerable to it. It's like, well, if someone's really struggling with gender confusion, should you use a pronoun because you want to be compassionate? I mean, there's the niceness and the kindness that I think people want. If you're really struggling, what's really the best? And then you realize just how deep the capture goes in so many spheres. In the shadows, all this infrastructure was built, and there was this psychological conditioning to make the public accept this as not only normal but good and something to be celebrated. But everything is such a manipulative reversal because then you start to see the real harm and you realize I can't participate in this at all in order to make people understand what's really happening and how they've been gaslit so much to believe that what they they're supposed to not even absorb the truth with their own, like, who's it going to believe? Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes, right? And so that took a lot of adjustment. But no, I mean, right from the bat, I started meeting feminists. I mean, the Heritage Foundation you mentioned has been on this issue very early on. Ryan Anderson, who used to be a scholar there and now is at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, was very much a forerunner in this space. And he would host events cross-partisan with Republicans, Democrats, feminists, lesbians, Christian conservatives alike, who, I mean, the first panel they hosted, if I recall correctly, was back in 2017, February, where they had a cross-partisan panel. And I learned about the Women's Liberation Front, who had filed a lawsuit against the Obama administration for violating the Administrative Procedures Act. And so I just started talking and reaching out and got connected with some other groups that had been forged, a lot of them cross-partisan or nonpartisan, and people were just starting to find each other and connect the dots. And just started to do hardline news, hard news, frontline news reporting for the next couple of years. And one of the things that I would do, Matt, would be, as this became one of my beats, I would just try to decode the mainstream news when they would report something like the first quote unquote non-binary person to be designated X on his sex marker. And the mainstream press would gaslight everybody with this crazy lingo and false language. What I would do is just pitch the story to my editors and say, let me just write this from a scientific, biologically based, objective perspective so that we can at least translate the argle bargle into plain English so that there can be something that's declaring there's a news source that people can read and not be confused. I did that a lot. And, people noticed. I started being messaged by random people saying, I never thought I'd read the Christian Post, but I appreciate you're just treating this like objective truth and science because I'm so confused by this. And oftentimes the people that would find me had either one of their own children or a family member that was getting into this, and they saw the destruction it was having in their lives and in their families' lives, and they were just trying to look for sanity. But everywhere they would turn in the mainstream media was peddling the confusion, and so they would just started scouring the internet, and they wound up in my inbox. There's this sort of a funny thing that happens when you refuse to go along with what's culturally popular, and you're just insistent upon clear language and not confusing people. And um, we're not ashamed of our faith convictions here at the Christian Post. We have a statement of faith that clearly delineates that, and it's not as though we hide our perspective. But I really wasn't filling articles with scriptures or anything, or trying to wax eloquent about theology, even though sometimes it's appropriate because pastors are commenting on it, and so they draw that aspect in. But a lot of times, a lot of the articles, especially some of the in-depth ones, I wouldn't even mention religion or faith or God very much at all, only if an interviewee said something and I was quoting him or her. Because frankly, you don't need to believe in God to believe that, men aren't women. But I mean, it sure helps. But I was struck by the fact that, I am coming at this as a Christian, but I'm just also coming at this as someone who values telling the truth. And so my faith bolsters me, it encourages me, it fuels me, it inspires me. But I really didn't have to write too much about it except where it was explicitly warranted. And I think a lot of people, including some secular voices, really appreciated that. And they didn't expect to see that in a publication that is literally the Christian Post. But through that approach to my own reporting, I met a wide variety of people from across the political spectrum, atheist, agnostic, and religious, all of it. So that has indeed been a silver lining.
By the way, I want to note for subscribers that it is because of Brandon that I have been invited to some of the events in DC that I have covered for the distance, and I even stayed on his couch while I was covering the FTC workshop. So if you are a free subscriber, consider upgrading to support this work. The podcast will continue after 2026 at my home website, osborneinc.com. And now back to you, Brandon. You were talking about your writing, which you sort of did not have an explicit spirituality to it. But then in your podcast, you have been unapologetic in a frankly religious framing of the whole thing. And I have to say, my own personal perspective is that there are some people in our very broad quote unquote movement who don't like the words demonic or spiritual or
Yeah.
scriptural or biblical and so on.
Mhm. Yeah.
But if the distance has done anything as a project, which I intend to pursue as a book project in 2026, on the subject that this website has established a very clear and undeniable streak of spirituality, a thread that is woven throughout transgender ideology and practice. I'm just going to cite a couple of words. The first is Gnosticism, which I'm sure
Hmm.
you know.
Hmm.
It's older than Christianity. It was a
Yeah.
major outside influence on early Christianity, and Christianity, in fact, had to throw off those influences in order to become a religion. And then after that, the historical encounters between Gnostic heresy and Christianity are extremely bloody, right? I won't go over the whole history, but you can find all kinds of examples, right up to the Protestants before the split with the Church of Rome, being accused of Gnosticism because that's what was understood as the enemy of the church.
Yeah.
And then all of modern esoteric religion is just full of Gnosticism. There's a whole academic literature about Hegel and Feuerbach and Marx and Engels and all those 19th century metaphysicians of history being a bunch of Gnostics. And then
Mhm.
recently, Corey Cohn on this podcast told us about Christian Protestants who
Mhm.
show up to oppose the pediatric transition bans.
Mhm.
And they harbor ideas that they state out loud and literally title as Gnostic.
Yeah.
So there is a sense in which this is about the ideological war against sort of the fundament of something,
Right.
American civilization, civic religion. And point two, I don't have to believe in demons. You're right. I don't have to believe in demons to agree that chopping healthy body parts off gay kids to make them look straight is demonic. I don't have to believe in magic to see that the parents of Jazz Jennings are doing exactly what Phoenician Molech cultists did. They have sacrificed their child through the fire for social capital.
Yeah.
So you have called outwardly on the church to oppose the belief and the practice of
Right.
transgenderism. So take a minute, please, to speak
Yeah.
freely from your own mind and heart, Brandon, about this thing you have wrestled against. I really think it's important to get this out.
Yeah, thank you. And some of our podcast episodes do indeed explore the spiritual and theological dimensions of this more fully. Other episodes are more just strict science. We really tried to be trying to be all things to all people, but the Gnostics, as you mentioned, from the Greek word gnosis, meaning one who knows. I won't go into all of the details, but basically the tyranny and the virulence of what Gnostic teaching is that the body is bad and the spirit is good. There's this mind body split of sorts that rampages and morphs over the centuries. And I think transgenderism and all of the medical apparatus that props it up I sometimes called it neo-Gnosticism on steroids, literally. But it is a pathological creed that splits and dissociates human beings from their bodies in pursuit of a lie. Because no one has ever been or ever will be born in the wrong one. You are your body is you, and you are male or female, and that can never be changed. And so the fact that we know it's so totalitarian because it takes brute force and institutional heft to enforce that. No one would ever come to believe that about themselves apart from raw power of some kind, trying to convince themselves of something that's so obvious. And one of my favorite quotes that I've seen the TERFs and other people say, I think it's from Sal Grover, who's a women's rights activist in Australia. She says, if you tell me, and I'm paraphrasing, if you tell me that some women have a penis, I'm going to assume you're going to lie about everything because if you lie about something so obvious, I'll assume you lie about everything because it's just the epistemological crisis of will you say what is true and not try to convince people of something that is so obviously false? I think that's just further evidence of the virulence of this Gnostic lie that's at the center of the modern trans movement. But yes, we've covered it extensively here at the Christian Post. I think in terms of why the word demonic applies, I'll say that I have had people who don't believe in God who, like you were just saying, Matt, they've said, "Oh man, if anything could make me believe in demons, this stuff would, because when you see children being torn apart, I mean, it just taps into something so primal that even if you don't have a paradigm or a grid for who God is or what God is, it's just something strikes at the core of what it means to be human, and that you don't cut a child's secondary sex traits off the penis or the breast, whatever it is, or it just, and you just disfigure something that they need to function in life. I mean, there's just something so unbelievably grotesque about it that you have to be so dissociated and desensitized to believe that this is not only medically wise, but a good thing. I think that's just part of the demonic aspect nature of it. But the other thing I think I would say is that coming at it from a Christian standpoint, um, we have a tremendous value for, as Christians, the human body, because our faith, unlike any other God, became a human body. And there can be no higher affirmation of our bodies than the fact that Jesus Christ, God's Son, put on flesh and dwelled with us. I mean, there's no other faith in the world where that is the case. Also, Scripture does refer to the human body as the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so to desecrate something that is so central to the human body, the sex of the body, in pursuit of something that will never change, uh, that is, I think, it's just sort of the ultimate uh, desecration of the body. And it's also, I think, a profound idolatry. I've said this many times, but our executive editor here at the Christian Post likes to say that transgenderism represents the epitome of the idolatry of self. So not only is the body physically desecrated by way of untested drugs and surgical scalpels, it is also there's a certain narcissism that goes along with gender ideology where we effectively tell God, you made a mistake. I'm going to be who I want to be and use pharmaceuticals and surgical instruments in order to do that. When in fact you haven't changed a thing about yourself. And so, but it's that idolatrous aspect of it. And so all of that rolled together, the desecration, the rejection of the incarnation, and also just the utter idolatry of it, all of that rolled together to me constitutes something deeply demonic. Um, but I think if that wasn't enough, just theologically speaking, when you see the misery that this unleashes, when you see the scarred bodies of the detransitioners who are sort of exhibitionist, displaying their, armpit to armpit scar of their chest after having had their breast removed, or the grotesque pictures of bottom surgeries. I've seen a few of those, unfortunately. And then you hear from the broken, shattered families. I mean, people start using the word demonic even if they don't believe in demons, because the suffering is just so extreme and horrendous. That's my take on it.
So let's say that I was going to turn your podcast into a
Mhm.
book,
Mhm.
your journalism, all of it into a book. Let's just talk about the different chapters that would be in this book. My guess is that you would start with families, that the family would be the first chapter of the book, the middle chapter of the book, and the ending chapter of the book, and the framework of the book. I could be wrong about this, but I think Ted Hudako would probably need his own chapter just to illustrate that chapter. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, poor Ted. His case, I've covered it extensively on our podcast. I've written some articles about it. He's also some other journalists have documented various aspects of his story. I've lost count, Matt, how many families I've spoken to over the years. I couldn't tell you how many phone calls, emails, messages I have received from all over the world. United States, England, Australia, Canada, parts of Europe. It's blown me away, the reach of how where my work has traveled, and the Zoom calls and the phone calls and the online chats I've had with moms and dads who are at the end of themselves, tormented, tortured, shattered, shredded. These are the words they use. I mean, the way this has upended their lives. Some of them are featured in my podcast, as well as their other children who are not being transed. Um, the phrase that sticks with me was one mom who described what it's like to lose a child to this is an exquisite form of torture. I mean, there is no suffering like it. The misery that this has unleashed on countless families is incalculable. There is nothing like it. It affects absolutely everything in your life, and it fractures relationships with other family members and neighbors and friends and communities. There isn't a single area of your life that this won't devour, and ruthlessly so. So, a whole chapter, if we were to write a book on the families, yes, Ted's would probably have his own because of how long and drawn out that particular battle was. But every family probably has uh, a story that probably could fill a similar length of chapter. Ted's is interesting because of all the courts and the legal steps he is still taking and has been taking. But um, I've never seen suffering like this. And I think what makes it incalculable and so deep and profound is that no one knows how to deal with this. If you lose a child to cancer, or if they die or in a car accident, everybody's so immediately sympathetic. There's, networks of social support. These parents have been stumbling around in the dark trying to figure this out. And some of them have connected on forums like the Pit Substack, and they've had to find each other, through sort of trial by error, and just it's taken them years to even find other people who were desperate and asking questions, and they couldn't understand what was going on because depending on where they live, they face ostracism and social exclusion for not affirming their quote unquote trans child, for not accepting their daughter as their son. And so they deal with that. And then, especially if the child medicalizes, there's an even deeper trauma because if they're an only child and they take all these drugs, daughter takes testosterone for a couple of years, her uterus atrophies, she has to have a prophylactic hysterectomy, she's sterile, they're not going to be grandparents. And so they mourn that loss. I mean, this just has such long reaching effects, but no one knows the suffering. It's taken them years to just find other people where they can process their own grief in a way where other forms of grief, people rush to help. And there's an immediate understanding that this is a tragedy. Not so with this. And so it's a grief and it's a suffering and it's a pain like no other, even if they just are asking questions. Even if people are just not sure about it, sometimes I've heard stories where they are just immediately shut down and called names because how dare would you not accept your own child? When no, there are legitimate medical questions to ask, particularly if your daughter or your son's going to be taking drugs that could render them sterile or, lose a body part. I mean, this is parents love their kids more than they love their own lives, a lot of them. And so they're looking out for them. They don't want to see them physically harmed. And yet somehow all of society, especially in very left-wing areas, was psychologically conditioned to turn on people who didn't immediately accept and affirm. And so there's so many layers of the suffering families and parents, particularly if they weren't ready to go along with this. And yeah, so they wind up in my inbox.
As a follow-up, I don't know if you are able to speak to this, Brandon, but do you think that Republicans are going to introduce that parents' rights bill they've been working on this year? Do you think that they've got Democrats in this trap of they all just shouted about how parents need to be able to sterilize their children. We can't be America without parents sterilizing their children. And now I feel like Republicans are ready to spring the trap shut and let Democrats go, oh, parents are the last people in the world who should decide whether their children can be trans. What do you think? What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, the Republicans in Congress did indeed pass two bills recently in the Senate about prohibiting transing kids, and so they might do the parental rights one. They might vote on it. I don't think it's likely to go anywhere in the Senate, though I could be wrong. Maybe they'll surprise me. I found that a lot of moderate Republicans are still too afraid of the issue, and the margins are pretty tight right now, especially in the House. But I think, especially, I mean, what they might be waiting on, I can't get inside the heads of congressional Republicans because this place where I live, DC, is a real swampy, dirty place, and there's all kinds of calculations and horse trading that goes on. And Republicans at the state level, maybe, but at the congressional level here, it's a different dynamic. Um, the Supreme Court may take a parental rights case up this Friday, from what I hear. They're conferencing on whether or not those issues will be some that they consider the constitutionality of with respect to schools doing secret gender transitions and not informing the parents about it. And then, so if the Supreme Court adjudicates that case and decides in favor of the parents, that would be a national reassertion of parental rights. And so there would be a Supreme Court case that would have impact in a way that uh, federal law may not. So I don't know what they'll do. Um, yeah, it's really hard to see that there has been a gradual awakening of just the issue more generally, j- with especially in the last election. And so Republicans have used the issue effectively to win battles, and there have been certainly state laws, and even in the NDAA that was passed, there was a single-sex sports provision in there. Now it's limited to military academies, but that's gotten through Congress. And with parental rights, though, I think I don't know. There've been executive orders and agency action and Supreme Court stuff. So Congress is kind of a different animal, but I mean, the House, like I said, the House did vote on two bills and passed two bills to strip this transing thing stuff out of transing kids out of Medicaid. And there was Marjorie Taylor Greene's bill, who she's now resigned from Congress, but that was passed. So it's possible they'll vote on it, but things really tend to stall out in the Senate because there's moderates that kind of shrink back from the social issues, and they don't have, and even if they did have 53 rock-ribbed conservatives over there, anything these days has to be a filibuster. And the Democrats will, unless they get rid of the filibuster, which I don't think they will, the Democrats are still committed to this. Will they spring the trap shut? Will they spring this trap shut? I don't know. I kind of feel like the whole world is convulsing now with Venezuela and possibly Iran and fraud in Minnesota. There's so many issues that are rising to the fore, and the transgender thing, it still matters to people, but it's kind of like, is it getting lost in the mix? Maybe a little bit, but I think the public's patience is wearing thin, I will say. And the issue continues to be uh, one that really just epitomizes the craziness of our time. And I think people across the spectrum are getting tired of it. But the Democrats still appear to be doggedly committed to it because they have believed that it's the next frontier of civil rights. And so breaking that mindset is very tough, though there are some Democrat defectors here and there, including, I think, three or four that voted for those bills banning transing kids recently. So it's tough.
That's very interesting because it underlines just how false this picture of Republicans just being so eager to use this campaign
Yeah.
issue really is. It's a false picture.
Yeah.
Um, Getting Republicans to move has actually been, just fighting that inertia has been the primary battle of people involved in this movement, getting them to actually care.
And a lot of that's because of shock. I can tell you, Matt, that even the Republican state legislators, when they first learned of it, were in utter disbelief because it wasn't something they were so familiar with. For example, I've met Robin Lundstrom many times. She's a friend now, I can say. She was the first one to get a bill banning the transing of kids in the state of Arkansas. And when she was brought, when they were, she was discussing that with her colleagues back in 2020 or 2021, it passed. It was the first bill passed in April of 2021. Uh, she thought, oh, this is this transing kids thing. This is just California, New York. This is not in Arkansas. And then someone came to her and said, actually, there's a couple hundred kids at the Little Rock Children's Hospital where they're doing this. And she was floored. And so she took action right away. But I mean, and to their great credit in Arkansas, even though they had to override a Republican governor's veto of the bill, they got it done right away. I mean, so there have been states where you have to really urge them to move, but there have been some wonderful exceptions where when they get it, they moved and they got it done. And in 2023, there were 17 states in that year alone that prohibited the transing of kids, some bills better than others, but that forced the issue to be uh, a national conversation piece because suddenly people realized something's really wrong here because why are they banning this if it's not happening? Um, that was a deflection tactic. Oh, that's not happening. People would say that when no, in fact, it was. And getting Republicans or anybody else who, I mean, Democrats that voted with them get excoriated in primary. There's been a couple of instances of that. And so, but people are genuinely shocked and it paralyzes them. And so getting them to move and figuring out the best legislative fix because things are going to be challenged in court is it, you want to be wise here. And there's culture war stuff and people typically don't like those kinds of things because it's really touchy. But the gravity of what was happening, it finally sunk in that, yeah, it's actually happening and it's worse than we thought. And so something has to be done. And here we have half the states that have now some kind of prohibition on the books. But yeah, pushing past the shock is hard. I was shocked when I first learned of it. And I just like, how do I even write about this? Nobody will believe me.
In fact, you started podcasting about this just about the same time that
Yeah.
Republicans got serious about
Mhm.
getting males out of women's sports, banning puberty blockers. You focused on putting voices forward that had not been heard.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, if we made a book of your work, what would the chapter on detransitioners be like?
Oh, the detransitioners, that would be a chapter about intense diabolical manipulation and deception and catastrophic medical harm and suffering of the most vulnerable. Those with whom I have interacted were, and this is typical, sometimes autistic, often suffering from other mental health conditions, really struggling in family, and activists in schools or clubs or online enticed them into this discordant gender identity and convinced them that taking drugs and cutting off body parts was the solution. And it came at a time when, and COVID really magnified this because people were struggling enough with the lockdowns, being isolated, and it kind of swept up a generation of young people into its dragnet. And then, but after those medical interventions, I don't even want to dignify them by calling them that, but after this barbarism was carried out on their bodies and they realized that it didn't fix their problems, they go through this phase where, I mean, even online, they are goaded into saying death before detransition. But they think that it's better to die than to try and admit that you got snookered, you were enticed into a lie, and you allowed catastrophic harm to happen. Uh, the pain becomes so great. If I would write a chapter on detransitioners, it would be the pain of not admitting the truth became so unbearable that detransitioning was the only option for them to keep their sanity because the misery was so intense. And so the pain had to get so bad that they had to finally admit to themselves that this was all a crock, that they were lied to, and that they got hoodwinked into believing something false. And not only did they believe something false, they did something and chose to participate in this, thinking that it would solve their problems. And let me just say too, Matt, if this happened to them when they were minors, I certainly don't believe them to be at fault here because they should have been protected. For young adults, it's a little bit different, but even those young adults, a lot of them are mentally ill, and the lion's share of the blame, I think, goes to the activists and to the predatory doctors and to all of the influencers who were pushing this on them uh, and didn't operate with good ethics at all. But no, there's the story of the detransitioners is one of just enormous suffering and grief and regret. And what we have allowed to happen to them as a society is not only a medical scandal for the history books, but one of the biggest moral outrages, an utter disgrace. Um, and I don't think the history will look kindly upon this time when something so barbaric was allowed to happen to vulnerable young people. I mean, I think when people see children getting hurt, that really, like I was saying earlier, that really hits them hard. There's something very primal and human about seeing a child be harmed, but the young adults too. I mean, this medical scandal affected the most innocent and vulnerable among us. And and I think what was different about this medical horror, this scandal, was that you didn't really see, take medical scandals of yesteryear like lobotomies or thalidomide or even opioids. there wasn't a cultural brainwashing to undergo those practices or take those drugs tied to this sense of who you are. Concurrent with the unethical medicine was this cultural and ideological brainwashing that you had to believe that this was going to allow you to become your true self. Selfhood was tied up into these disgraceful medical practices. And so the deprogramming that had to happen for all of the victims of the scandal was just another layer that I think sets it apart, where they were trained to believe that harm to their bodies was actually health, that it was empowering to display your body on Instagram after it had parts cut off in a very exhibitionist fashion, that that was something to be proud of and boast about publicly. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen a medical scandal where that was the case. I don't know of any. Maybe there are, but that is just I mean, I find that just to be a particularly just horrible aspect of this, that people were encouraged to broadcast the harm and receive social rewards and reinforcement from people, leaving comments and emojis. Oh, you're so brave. You look stunning. All this, the cultural brainwashing that went on with that, not only of themselves, but of their communities that were supposed to reinforce it and encourage more of it. Uh, that what was, that's what the detransitioners have endured. Um, and I think a lot of them, I mean, one of them told me, I've met a man who underwent an orchiectomy, and in the process of his, transition when he was leading up to it, the people at his progressive church were encouraging him along and telling him you're so brave. And then when he detransitioned, they suddenly got very quiet and would even make kind of snide comments under their breath. He would hear things about people talking about him behind his back, like, well, he just became a bigot. So there was all this encouragement for him to do it, but once they realized that it was all a lie, there wasn't that commensurate support. I mean, so it's they've been through the ringer, and that's putting it mildly.
Then there are the whistleblowers and the clinicians, the people who are at the scalpel's edge in this fight.
Yeah,
I would say that this is probably the most dramatic policy chapter.
yeah.
So talk about that.
Well, the whistleblowers who have seen how this works from inside hospitals and clinics and psychiatric, psychological offices, they are, in my opinion, Matt, the bravest among us. I think of Dr. Eitan Heim, Nurse Vanessa Sivage, Clinical Research Manager Jamie Reed, just to name three. There are other medical professionals who've seen this from the inside, and all three of those people, by the way, that I just mentioned, spoke at the Federal Trade Commission last in July, as you mentioned earlier, the FTC workshop that you attended when you stayed at my house. They've seen it, you know, more clearly than any of us. Those of us who are reporters and journalists and docu-podcasters, were taking their testimony, we're writing about it, but they actually saw the records on computers that falsified medical diagnoses, misuse of billing codes for conditions that the patients didn't have to justify, giving children blockers and hormones and surgeries and all that. You know, Jamie Reed has talked about the conversations she had with her colleagues about how they were going to justify things and defraud the insurance, and no scrupulous behavior at all going on in these settings, and the vulnerable people that were there, and not only that, but the retaliation that has happened against those whistleblowers. I mean, Dr. Eitan Heim had the feds going after him. Now, miraculously, the case was dropped with prejudice because the Trump administration saw it for what it was, but he very well could have gone to jail, and I think is still probably in debt from all the legal bills. I mean, so the whistleblowers have the most courage of anybody in this space because they're the ones who saw it right up close. And it takes enormous guts to go up against the medical establishment and their ideological activist defenders who are just some of the most ruthless people out there today. And I've gotten to know pretty much a lot of the famous whistleblowers that are in this space. I do know them all, and I have the highest respect and regard for them and their courage, because it really, I can't underscore enough how much guts and grit and determination and courage it takes for them to say no. I saw this. This is wrong. I'm not going to accept this. I'm going to make a stink about it. Um, I'm just so moved by those who saw it from the inside and dared to stick their neck out because they've paid a dear price.
I think this book we're imagining would turn optimistic because your podcast has.
Mhm.
So, talk about that. How are you feeling about the policy fight? What do you look forward to in 2026? What do you think is going to happen that we should talk about?
Well, I say optimistic. I'll say cautiously optimistic because I'm under no illusions about the tentacles and the infrastructure and the manipulation tactics that trans activists have employed and continue to employ. But 2025, we expected it to be a year of enormous change. And indeed, throughout, I mentioned the bills that got passed in Congress, which are they might pass the Medicaid one in the Senate. That actually might happen if they can get that through a reconciliation bill. I don't know, but certainly the executive branch with President Trump's orders and the DOJ investigations, the HHS moves, which have been very good, the reports and these are being tied up in court, but like the agency heads, I was there in late December watching the head of the FDA, NIH, HHS, all the secretaries, the CMS office. They're coming out swinging, rejecting this for children, and they're implementing new standards and they're starving hospitals of federal funds. Some of the gender clinics have closed as a result. And so, they're on defense now in a way that they haven't been before. You mentioned the Federal Trade Commission. I heard from a source yesterday that they are actively at work and they're doing their part where they have authority within the marketing of these products for-profit companies that are trying to sell these horrible things to young people, deceptive marketing, deceptive trade practices. So the agencies are at work, and there's also a um, cultural push against it. People are really tired of it. There was an article in Skeptic magazine which even showed it was disputed, but it was showing a declining, number of people identifying as this, and so there's been a real I think there's been an awakening of sorts along those lines. And of course, the Scrimeti victory, 6-3 ruling, allowing Tennessee's law banning the chemical transing of kids to stand, and that then protects half the states who have passed similar laws on those constitutional grounds, at least. And I expect that by the time June rolls around, it's likely, very likely, that women's sports, bills, Idaho and West Virginia, that's being heard next week here, that will be allowed to stand. And then there was a counseling case where a Christian counselor was not allowed, Colorado passed a ban saying you can't counsel people with gender confusion. And that was heard in December. I think we'll probably, I mean, on free speech grounds alone, that's not constitutional, but by the time June rolls around, there will have been several Supreme Court wins, and those have national implications. And so, Matt, even though I know the tentacles of this and the infrastructure of this and the money behind this is enormous, I've been at this nearly a decade. No way am I going to sniff at this progress because it's substantial, and some of it I believe will last. Could it all go away if a Democrat wins in 2028? Of course. But will they will they have the same kind of vim and vigor and verve about it by then, or will something else happen this year or next that completely dismantles it? We're living in strange times. It's entirely possible. I mean, things are happening very quickly. And I just wonder if there might be a moment or two where something will happen where the public kind of suddenly decisively turns against this once and for all. I can envision something like that maybe happening. But I have to say, when I was first starting to cover this in the early years of 2016, 17, and 18, I felt like I was shouting into the void. It was hardly any, you couldn't even get people to believe you, let alone do anything about it because it was so confusing and shocking. And so now people are understanding it enough to at least curtail some of it. And again, I'm just not going to sniff at any victory because I think it's just it's the vindication of hard scrabble shoe leather journalism, doggedly determined to just continue to get stories out about what's really happening. Yes, it really is happening. You got to believe me, and here's the proof. And it's been hard. And I think the real test, I think we will know that we will have won this fight when the mass media is no longer able to frame these issues as a right versus left fight. Because for so long, the mass media has characterized all opposition to transing anything as religious rights, latest culture war, blah, 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 versus all the sophisticated science believing liberals. And now that that narrative has been disrupted some, even though the media is still very much pushing the trans dogma, they're starting to modulate their language a little bit. And so as soon as the spell off the press breaks, some of that's starting to happen. Um, that's when we know that the jig is up, I think. And I think the other big piece of this, where we know that real progress is being made, is when all of the major medical associations either are forced to admit the truth. I mean, the Attorney General of Florida is now suing them, AMA, and I think AAP and Endocrine Society. They're all ideologically captured, and the AG of Florida, Mr. Utmeyer, is suing them. And so because that's the line that's in all of the mass media, that every major medical association approves gender affirming care or gender related care. I think that's what they're calling it now, as science backed, all approved. This is above board, no debate, all that. Once they lose the backing of all the major medical associations, that's when we know that'll be dismantled. But they should never be allowed to get away with this, Matt, because they've lied for years. They've been captured for years. They've they've redrawn their guidelines just in keeping with the dictates of activists. I mean, activists were part of the formation of some of these guidelines, even though they're not doctors. So it's like I saw, there's so many tentacles and layers to it, but um, I think we're going to see more progress this year. I mean, you start seeing criminal referrals for fraudulent billing, some of these hospitals that have done that. We start to, maybe there's some detransitioner lawsuits, percolating still, step by step, bit by bit. You just keep going. And I think we'll see this consigned to the dustbin of history where it belongs. But like I was saying earlier, the suffering of the detransitioners and their families, that's going to last a long time. And they'll really need a lot of help for many years to come. They're not going to forget this so easily, even if everybody else tries to.
And of course, what we should probably note is how all of this is sort of taken out of our hands now, right?
Hmm.
It's out of our hands. We are only able to report on it anymore. But talk about that networking, because I've been in the same room with
Yeah.
Republican legislators and radical feminist lesbians and gay men and tons of current or former Democrats all at the same time with you.
Hmm.
So there's something to be said for this ecumenical
Yeah.
approach that you've taken,
Yeah.
because the diversity of your reporting and advocacy network is extraordinary. And I use that horrible word diversity in
Yeah.
its,
Just,
intended
yeah.
meaning.
Yeah. Yeah. I made a decision early on in my own work that I wanted to be a safe place to land no matter what. And that even if people disagree vehemently with my views on a lot of things as a socially conservative evangelical Christian, that I didn't want people to be afraid to talk to me, uh, particularly when it's on something so consequential. And I get very annoyed with a certain swath of religious people who just likes to tut tut and, well, we tried to tell you this was going to lead to this and you wouldn't listen. And that sort of smug, religious, proud bravado, I just don't have any patience for that. And so even if I did and do disagree with, all kinds of people, like, look, the truth is true no matter who says it. And I just I was willing to host a broad range of voices because I think one of the big problems of our time is that everybody lives inside their own bubbles and echo chambers. And so I wanted to show to the world that the Christian Post, even though we were clear about what we believed, theologically speaking, we have a statement of faith. I wanted to at least show that we would host the conversation around this that the mainstream media refused to largely. So when you see something wrong and uh, the New York Times won't let you speak, or all your media outlets that you use, that you read, don't give you a voice or they misquote you. They got to talk to some journalists, and so I was like, "Hey, I'll talk." And I think it surprised people to see that we would actually let them speak, even if they knew we disagreed. And I think we've done that well at the Christian Post. But I think part of it too was that I know that this is just my own personal feeling, but conservative leaning Christians aren't heard or listened to very much for various reasons in this society we now live in. Um, I think I understand some of the reasons why that is, but particularly if religious people speak with a lot of distinctly religious language or scripture and people who aren't religious that just like speaking Urdu to them. I mean, we are a much more secularized society today than we once were. And so some people just don't understand what Christians are talking about because they speak Christianese. And so it's just like, well, even if they're saying something that I kind of sort of agree with, the language that they're using is just not on my grid at all. And so that's the thing. But I, uh, I also think that there's a tendency to just dismiss anything that conservative leaning Christians have to say because it is assumed that we're just dragging religion into it, that we don't really have a scientific reason for believing in this. It's just because of this is what their religion teaches them to do, even if we don't bring it up at all. That's just the default assumption that some people have. And so by me trying to talk to people and quoting other people that the masses might be more likely to listen to, or at least consider, I mean, I just was like, look, if you think it's wrong to cut the body parts off a child, pretty awfully low bar, but like I'll let you speak. Like I'll talk to you. I mean, I didn't, you try to show a diversity of voices, a range of views, and yeah, I mean, it was people were trying to do something about it. And so when you have a journalist that's willing to talk, even if you disagree with them, and you can trust that they'll quote you accurately and represent you fairly, it speaks volumes. And so if I've done one thing well, I think that's one of them. And um, especially in the podcasting, the docu podcasting that we did, it was very effective to hear a range of voices in conversation with a storyline that was just telling it how it was happening. And I think it's more effective that way, much more persuasive when you hear, people who have different viewpoints and professional backgrounds that can really connect the dots for people. Um, and our podcast has had it's great success. I continue to receive feedback on most unlikely people who I wouldn't have ever thought would download a podcast under the Christian Post masthead, but it's that's very affirming. And like I say, truth is truth, no matter who says it. And so I'm going to try and platform that no matter what.
I'm reading feminists who criticize the sexual revolution.
Mhm.
I'm I'm looking back as a historian. I'm seeing now things I did not discern before. Some
Mhm.
of it just due to age, like
Yeah.
Andrea Dworkin.
Hmm.
Okay, she makes sense to me now when I did not get her point of view in the 1980s.
Yeah.
To some extent, it was technology, right? The internet,
Yeah.
and experience that altered my perspective.
Yeah.
Um, the arc of your podcast experience is that it started out raising the alarm, and now that everyone is acting on that alarm, it has become a broader cultural critique. So
Yeah.
take a minute, if you would, a victory lap, I guess, to talk about that. Talk about, as you wind things down, that broader cultural critique that you have about how we got to this place.
Yeah, you find that when you're tackling an issue that strikes to the core of our humanity, and I think gender ideology does because it's literally trying to do something impossible, change the sex of a person, that there are so many deeper questions that come about because of the insane thing that it's trying to do. You can't help but ask, how did we get here? Where is this going? What am I here for? How in the world did this become a thing? Is this part of a larger trend? Those kinds of questions they come about just by virtue of digging into this issue at all. And so we've done 5 seasons of 5 episodes each, plus a bonus episode in each season. Ted Hudako's case is featured prominently in 3 of those seasons. And I will just say season 2 is the audiobook of an ebook that I wrote, just by the way. But we did indeed start to raise the alarm when we first launched the first season in the fall of 2022, just when the legislators were starting to make some make some things happen. But you realize that this, like I said, it strikes the core of our humanity. What does it mean to be a human being? I mean, that's a very fundamental question. And actually, moreover, what is a human being? Because if you're going to desecrate your body and you're trying to erase the sex of a person or change the sex of a person, it's like just think of how profoundly dehumanizing that is. And so we just started to look at every angle we could of the contributing factors that helped move this movement along. And as it was destroying families and young lives, we just started asking those deeper questions. And I think it is impossible to imagine a world in which transgender ideology took off without the sexual revolution fueling it and contributing to it in the background. Because I think whether you're religious or not, I think it's hard to deny that the social upheaval and everything that erupted in the 60s with free love, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, um, and even with the advent of the birth control pill and you know everything that came after that, the acceptance of gay marriage and hookup culture and just the porn saturated culture. Yes, you say Andrea Dworkin, that was before the internet, but the revolution that took place in our culture, I think when I think about all that has happened in the last few decades, part of me just says, well, no wonder we're so confused about sex and gender because it's just been relational chaos. And so it maybe this is sort of reaching the zenith, has it sort of reached its apogee in this movement where we are so crazy that we're now trying to cut the body parts, the sex traits off of children. I mean, I the religious right for all of its flaws, and I am a conservative leaning Christian, I think does indeed have a point when they made the argument back in the 80s and 90s that if we continue down this path, it's going to lead to things we thought unimaginable. Everybody was accusing them of the slippery slope fallacy. Well, the slope is pretty doggone slippery because when you fail to have a regard for the dignity of the body, it opens Pandora's box. And I have my own, maybe another podcast, we can talk about all of the things that I think the religious right did wrong in responding to it. But I think, I mean, I've even seen, leftists online who started to be really alarmed about all of the queer theorists and the trans activists who are doing all these despicable things, not only to women in their private spaces, but the medical stuff to children. And I think I may have took a screenshot. I think I saw a couple people say something in, threads saying, man, all the queer theorists and all the trans activists are making all those religious right preachers and from the 80s and 90s seem correct. Like they were like noticing that, yeah, this really this got way out of hand in ways that we never thought possible. But um, I do think the sexual revolution has done enormous damage to us as a society, and we have not begun to reckon with it remotely. In terms of feminists who are speaking about it, there have been feminist critiques of the sexual revolution, the most recent of which that I'm familiar with is Louise Perry, who in 2023 wrote a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. I've since learned that she's since become a Christian. And so I think if you start to critique the excesses and you start to see just how wild and chaotic and unhinged from relational health and normality we've become because of the sexual revolution, you just might find your way back to God because I would say as a Christian that his design is the best for human sexuality and gender. But even within certain religious contexts, there are some things that I think contributed to the morass that we now see, but that's a multi-layered topic for another day. But we did indeed do an episode on the sexual revolution and all that it brought about in the fifth season of our documentary podcast, in which we interview 5 or 6 different people who unpack it even more than I am here today.
On that note, how do listeners find your work?
Well, christianpost.com/Brandon-Showalter is my byline where you can see all of the print work that I've done. Doing more on the opinion side these days. Haven't written an op-ed column on the gender stuff in a while, but I might be here soon, but my colleagues continue to report at the Christian Post as well on the breaking news, and we're also running other commentary on these issues. If people would like to listen to the 5 seasons of the documentary podcast Generation Indoctrination, that's available on all major podcast platforms. And the landing page for that podcast, the Christian Post, is generationindoctrination.com. And I'll also just point everybody to a documentary that I appeared in about the families that have been impacted by this. That's called Dead Name, that was released in the Christmas time, 2022. Should be still available on Amazon, deadnamedocumentary.com, and uh, it's on Amazon Prime now. I mean, the censorship around this is not near what it was a few years ago, which is a blessing. And so that's on Amazon Prime, just Dead Name, 2022. It's about 50 minutes long. It's very poignant.
Brandon Showalter, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an epic adventure. You really should write a book.
Well, I've written an ebook. I've written an ebook called Exposing the Gender Lie, which that's another free resource on christianpost.com. If you see it, it's right there. It's for pastors or anybody who wants to read how this ideology functions. It's a 75-page. I co-authored it. So I've already written a book. If I write a memoir, it'll be further down the road and it'll probably be more than just about the gender stuff. But I would love to never have to write about this again because it'll knock the wind out of you. But thank you for inviting me, Matt. It's good to chat with you.
Thank you so much, Brandon. You have a great day.
Thank you.
You have listened to a production of OsborneInc.com. This podcast is still hosted at thedistancemag.com, an encampment for everyone rendered politically homeless by gender ideology. Visit either website to support my work with a premium subscription.